Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a privilege for me to speak about our government's commitment to closing the infrastructure gap in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. As you know, earlier, the Minister of Indigenous Services introduced Bill C-61, an act representing water source, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure for First Nation lands. My riding of London West neighbors and houses members of the Oneida Nation, the Thames and the Chippewas of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, and this bill is really important and a step forward for my community and for ensuring that everyone in Canada has access to safe and clean drinking water. First Nations have long called for legislation that affirms their inherent rights, recognizes their stewardship in keeping water clean, and meets First Nations needs. So this bill is part of the government's commitment to establish new proposed safe drinking water and wastewater legislation in consultation with First Nations. So today my remarks are going to focus on infrastructure and Indigenous housing. The federal government is committed to closing the infrastructure gaps in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities by 2030. And since 2016, we've committed more than $25 billion to support these efforts. Despite these investments, we know more work is needed. In the 2022-2023 period, the department engaged with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to identify and prioritize the infrastructure needs in their communities and the work required to close this gap. The government will continue to work directly with Indigenous partners and other federal organizations to identify what further measures and investments that may be required. This includes working with First Nation communities and organizations, other government departments, and financial institutions to define a new approach to how the department funds infrastructure for First Nations lands. Exploring how new financial tools could improve infrastructure service delivery will be a fundamental aspect of this infrastructure modernization. We know that housing is a fundamental need across the country, and we know that Indigenous peoples are more likely than the general population to experience poor housing conditions and overcrowding. So as part of our responsibility, our government supports Indigenous housing across the country from the east, the west, the north, and the south on reserve, but also in rural and urban areas. And I want to emphasize two important points. Indigenous housing is backed significant funding. In fact, the budget 2022 and the 2023 one alone committed up to $4.3 billion and $4 billion respectively. And since 2016, we've been tracking its progress and we've made together on housing. And although we acknowledge that there's still so much work to be done, Indigenous housing priorities are being co-developed with or led by Indigenous peoples with a focus on specific needs of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and self-governing modern treaty groups. In other words, Indigenous Services Canada does not work alone. Whether for water, housing infrastructure, the department works with Indigenous communities to make sure that we have the tools to decide, that they can use to decide for themselves. And that's why I want to highlight a few successful and innovative approach to housing that have been developed by Indigenous peoples. Madam Speaker, I'll begin with Nuhulk in Bella Coola, British Columbia, who have been building homes designed by and for their own people for many years now. This started with Richard Hall, Nuhulk Red Seal carpenter who worked in construction for 33 years as a builder and building inspector on and off reserve. Richard noticed that existing houses were not suitable for the climate, which is very wet with high winds and erratic temperatures. So he created and designed for homes and other buildings that could withstand these conditions. He also noticed that existing homes were not suited for all boiling people did in their kitchens to cook fish and wild game. So ventilation was improved with people being taught new maintenance and home care tips. Through its BC regional office, Indigenous Service Canada supported Nuhulk Nation with developing and implementing their own housing strategies. The Nuhulk Nation leveraged this funding along with their own equity and other financing partners to implement its vision for culturally appropriate and safe housing. They further reduced costs by using their own resources such as timber and mill. Madam Speaker, there are so many other examples of innovative housing across the country that I could share. For example, Indigenous innovators are moving forward in developing their own ideas under their Indigenous Homes Innovation Initiative. The initiative has Indigenous Steering Committee made up of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations, experts in infrastructure and housing. These selected innovators come from all regions of Canada, and their ideas cover a range of new ways to respond to Indigenous and social housing needs. The innovators are provided with mentoring support from Indigenous architects and other professionals to refine their ideas and build fully implementable projects. Some of the projects include Central Urban Métis Federation in Saskatoon built the Round Prairie Elders Lodge, a 3-story complex with 26 one-bedroom units. This facility offers wraparound health and cultural supports, enabling Métis seniors to live independently in an environment that provides services to address age-related challenges. This past July, the North Bay Indigenous Friendship Centre in Ontario built a 3-floor, 30-single-unit transitional housing facility called C-61 Village. It provides safe and accessible and dignified housing for Indigenous community members who are ready to leave the emergency shelter system. C-61, which means nest in Ojibwe, provides stable housing and necessary services to find permanent housing, employment, and overall long-term success. And the lower level is being used for programming, counseling, life skill teaching, and other gatherings. Madam Speaker, as I noted earlier, the responsibility for housing is shared, with partnership playing an important role to address on-reserve housing needs. Targeted funding, in addition to ongoing funding from Indigenous Services Canada, supports housing for projects in First Nation communities, including new builds, retrofits, and renovations. As of September 30th of 2023, ISC is supporting 4,631 housing projects in 611 First Nation communities. So far, in 2023, 2,763 new homes have been built, and another 5,956 homes renovated and upgraded, and many more underway. Another 1,005 housing-related capacity development and innovation projects have been funded in First Nation communities. This includes supporting the creation and implementation of housing authorities and housing managing training. Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada is working in partnership with Inuit, Tapirit, Kanatami, and Inuit treaty organizations on the delivery of Inuit-specific investments, premised on self-determination and the implementation of the co-developed Inuit Nunangat housing strategy. Since 2016, when the government began providing direct funding to Inuit partners, more than 500 new units have been constructed, with many more units repaired and critical Inuit-led housing programming expanded. This success will be accelerated by the budget of 2022 investment of $845 million over the next 7 years. So the 4 Inuit treaty organizations for determined housing delivery. So delivering housing in Inuit, Nunangat, and supporting those most in need requires all levels of government to work together. And this approach to housing differs in each of these 4 regions of Inuit, Nunangat, and can involve regional governments, public and private partners, and provincial or territory government, and of course, the Government of Canada. In 2018, a Canada Métis Nation Housing Sub-Accord was signed by the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Métis Nation leadership. The sub-accord outlined the design, delivery, and administration of housing services undertaken, such as purchasing new houses, repairing existing houses, and providing rent supplements to family in most need. To date, governing members of the Métis National Council and the Manitoba Métis Federation have bought or built 1,575 housing units and have renovated an additional of 4,600 housing units. They have also provided down payment assistance to 1,537 households and rental supports to 9,528 households. Madam Speaker, in March, the Manitoba Métis Federation opened Frimachi, a fresh beginning in Michif, with 4 2-bedroom suites and 16 studios, including 6 accessible units. The building includes a spiritual room, access to computers, free Wi-Fi, fully furnished units, free laundry, and more. Frimachi provides wraparound services like mental health and addiction help, employment and training, and cultural programming. In closing, Madam Speaker, the federal government has a responsibility for infrastructure and housing, But we are not the only ones, and it will take all levels of government to work together and many other partners. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For Kenora.